again, this is sort of an informal discussion, but I wanted to throw out some quick thoughts and observations. First of all, I've known Northampton since I was a child, because this is where my mother was born and my grandmother has always lived until this past fall. And so I've always experienced Northampton as a frequent visitor, but never as a resident. And I went to school at UMass, so I'm pretty familiar with coming around here for at least an extended duration in the 90s. And since then, I've come out and visited my grandmother more and more. You know, my perspective on Northampton is that obviously what you have as a community is a gem in many regards, at least within the state of Massachusetts, if not arguably in the Northeast. And there's an infinite amount of opportunity, and there's been some great execution of some excellent things that have really started moving folks in the directions I've heard everybody speaking about here. But obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be done and can be done. But we need to all remember and put it in perspective. There's very few places in the United States that have as good a transit system as you do for an area with the level of density that you have, that have multiple regional bike paths and on-street lanes, that have such a very nice, dense, walkable downtown with a mix of uses, regardless of what is underpinning the economy. It still is luckily a regional attraction. So there's some really strong and good and important things to remember about Northampton. I think one of the biggest threats for all of us, and it's been alluded to here a couple of times, is mostly the folks who are not in the room. You know, mostly the folks who are not saying smart and creative thoughts that I've heard from the majority of people here. And that's really the audience that in the end we all need to be hearing from more and to work with more. What's interesting when you think about walkable communities in America and you think about the things that really matter to folks, doesn't matter how many times you poll them, everybody does like walkable environments. The vast majority of the population wants to be in a place that's near transit, has a nice little walkable downtown. There has really been a measured change in folks' orientation, not necessarily where they live, of course, and largely because of land use patterns over the last several decades that we can explore in a much more fun presentation this evening, hopefully to a slightly broader audience. But ultimately, that has really painted a difficult picture. And I think even for all of us in the room, as high-minded as we might be about trying to make things safer, walkable, more bike-friendly, and of course more transit-oriented, we probably have this very basic conflict. For instance, how many folks get to walk, bike, or take transit to work and not drive in this room? That's an extremely good number. It's not 100% of us, but it's a good number. How many folks bike regularly, whether it be in commute or at least a couple times a week for non-recreational and exercise purposes? That's a great number as well. And how many of you try to go into downtown on a very regular basis by anything other than the car? That's great as well. So you guys, I hope, are the vast majority of people in Northampton, right? Case closed, we're done with all of our efforts. And I think, unfortunately, we all know that's not the reality. And, you know, I always grew up with what my grandmother's perceptions had been, which, you know, she started living in this area back in the teens and grew up in the 20s and 30s. And even though Florence is a nice little grid where she lived, and it was still mostly, you know, cornfields at that time, and the car came out and it completely changed their lives. And suddenly the family of 7 was driving around in this massive car, and that became the rest of their lives. And as Northampton's downtown transformed into less industrial and more retail, commercial oriented, it started to become that other downtown, and by the 80s and into the 90s, there was, that was NoHo, and she lived in Hamp in her mind. And it was always Hamp, and I know Hamp has come back as sort of a terminology a little bit, but what she saw was a distinction between the way of life she knew, which was extremely suburban and auto-oriented, and the way of life of downtown, which arguably was still not everything that this group may be, because much of it is about folks who drive in and drive out and deal with the parking problems that Bill Attender tries to deal with. But there's some inherent advantages, even if you can't get people out of their car, to making your downtown walkable. And it's not so much that we need to try to get everybody to walk more and walk further and ride the bus all the time, which would be a great goal. But sometimes it's simply the acknowledgement of reducing overall quantities of vehicle trips. And for instance, if you can create what we always in the industry call a park once environment, which is usually supported in a mixed-use downtown like Northampton's, just being able to park at one spot anywhere and hit multiple stops and multiple visits and then go back to your car has an enormous ability to reduce trip making, which also has an enormous ability to reduce congestion and environmental pollution and reduce the safety threats for all the other pedestrians that you encounter when you drive in downtown, because the vast majority of those pedestrians you encounter when you drive in downtown are other motorists who got out of their cars and are trying to do multiple stops in the downtown too. And I look at Main Street as one of the biggest threats to your ongoing sustainability, and it's simply just getting from one side to the other. And as has been mentioned similarly for King Street, the whole process of that simple trip is often done by motorists. And we have to acknowledge that there will be people who never get out of their car. But part of our goals are to make it such that if they're driving, they can hopefully eliminate the need to then go around the corner to the next store and then drive down the block to the next store. Because every single one of those moves is adding congestion, is adding turning movements, and is causing safety problems. Now, that means we have to accommodate the car. And that means King Street and Main Street still need to be able to accommodate the car. It'd be nice if somebody mentioned they were a little bit more rationalized and there wasn't quite as much chaos. Although there's, of course, a lot of progressive transportation thought that says the chaos is exactly the right thing because it slows people down and makes them look. But I think if there's a little bit too much chaos, a lot of people get frustrated. And that's a concern. That frustration is the biggest concern we have as transportation planners when trying to make safe streets, when trying to resolve parking issues, when trying to make transit a viable form of transportation. We're anxious creatures. We're human beings with too much brain matter that we don't know how to use, and we're always wanting to try to get to the next place and resolve the issue and get myself there and work as quickly and succinctly as I can, or as independently and not caring as I can. And a lot of our concerns in a place like Northampton is as we try to promote other modes of transportation, we need to always be taking into account what that's going to mean for the motorist. I don't want vehicle transportation to be the dominant theme in anything we talk about here today and over these 3 days. All we want is person transportation to be the dominant theme. Again, I could show you 100 slides of the efficiencies. It's very obvious. You can move far more people in much greater quantities, even in terms of time and distance, by every other mode of transportation other than a car when it gets to a certain point of density. Just the way it is. More people fit on a bus, more people can walk on a sidewalk, more people can ride bicycles than you can ever fit in the same space in a car. However, those cars are still part of what makes access to these communities to a place like Northampton arguably viable. And a lot of folks in Ward 6 will inevitably have to drive into downtown. But right now they don't even want to go. There's a conflict. There's a space issue. There's a safety issue. They can't find parking, whatever it is. And it can be somewhat difficult to just cross the street to the next destination. And I think that's really where we're going to work hard over the course of these 3 days to strike a balance. And that balance really has to go back to that point of moving people, and people do move by all modes of transportation. And it's really going to take a little bit of our aim to change the measures of what works. The measures of what works in a downtown are indeed some of the crash data that Laura provided us. But by the same extent, those crash numbers have historically always been counting motor vehicle crashes, and if there was a pedestrian or bicycle involvement, maybe it got included. The orientation of how that data is always recorded had to do with car crashes, and how it was recorded was only adequate enough mostly for insurance purposes. To really understand the details of a crash, it started to become something that is recorded in crash reports for police departments, but it isn't something that we can easily aggregate and look at very scientifically until we spend a lot of time at it. When you start to look at what causes safety problems in downtowns, you start to realize that there is so much more to it than just the simplicity of a person happened to get in front of a car, or the car happened to be going faster, or there was a bicycle conflict. It has to do with the design of that environment, and it has to do with the feeling of the place of that environment. And the two basic inputs to that are, what are the land uses, what's going on around that corridor, and what is the actual space you can move those vehicles in. And yeah, everybody has said it here. Main Street is massive. I don't care how slow folks go. I don't care how much we need snow storage. I don't care how much we need maneuvering for angled parking. Main Street is a massive street. And simply as a result of its design, of its geometry, it lends to too much potential safety issue, which is why some crash locations are fairly high along Main Street. King Street, exact same issues. And so much of the design of those roadways, and Rick can talk about this in much greater length than I ever could because he's far more sage in this and has got some great slides that hopefully we'll share with you tonight. Regardless of what the thinking has been in history, those roadways are designed for speed, for moving cars and not for people. And so much of what we need to do is sort of break that down. And break that down into, again, things that are more measurable bites. So, what the goal of the remainder of today is to try to work through each of these corridors, each of these locations in a sort of distinct way. What we want to do when we go out there is take a look at the infrastructure. I don't know, how many folks are actually able to go out on our walking tours over the course of, through until lunch? We're going to break for lunch and then maybe do some more in the afternoon. How many folks are going to come along with us? A few folks in this room. You're all welcome and invited to. You're all, if you need to bail out, that's fine, I understand. Really for us, being able to hear what you say works and doesn't work in all these locations is the fundamental of fixing that design. When I look at these roads, I look at what these streets might be able to be from my perspective, but I don't, travel them every day. I am not intimately familiar with them, and I also don't know the history of where issues might be. The numbers can tell me one thing, the traffic volumes can tell me another, but that's only just scratching the surface of how these places work. Because the streets are our front doors, they're places of movement, and in many cases doesn't matter how many sidewalks you put in, if the land uses are oriented to the car and the way the curb cuts work and the way the access is oriented to the car, nobody's going to walk on the sidewalks. So seeing these corridors from our perspective, but also from your perspective, will be interesting to see how far you really think the walkable downtown could extend, or whether you use, and bicycle, as you've all indicated, bicycling, King Street as a place, or as just a corridor to get through to somewhere else. Part of what we also want to do is look very discreetly at intersection design. And this is a very important and fundamental part of this as well, being able to look at all the phases in the signal and the crossings and what have you, but recognizing where cars actually move and how much time they have in those intersections, and then where people, pedestrians and bicyclists, actually are able to get through those intersections. And part of the new thinking in intersection design around the country is recognizing that we've been building intersections bigger and bigger and bigger to make them safe. And as soon as you make an intersection bigger, the crash rate goes up. And then it backfills with capacity, and it's just as congested as it ever was. And then you add more turning lanes, and you make them even bigger and bigger. And that thinking has worked directly to the detriment of downtowns like Northampton. And places like State and Elm really would work just as efficiently if they were small intersections. When you look at some of the places around the country that carry more volume than State and Elm, but are half the size, you really begin to understand how that might be able to be looked at a lot differently. And it's true of Main and King Pleasant and other intersections along King as well. And then finally, this is the 800-pound gorilla I like to always say is in the mix out there. And this is something else to think about as we walk around. And I'm sure Bill in particular will be thinking about this. But it's a very valuable and important commodity, parking. Parking, on-street parking, yeah, okay, it's a way for a car to get in. But as we all know, it's an incredible buffer from traffic. And it's also one of the best ways to access a downtown. And even if you want to get folks walking and biking and riding transit, it's oftentimes the case that they need to at least drive to a point before they can do a lot of that. And parking can work to our advantage dramatically. We all know of the wonderful, infamous reverse angle parking experiment in Northampton, I hope, where it was attempted. But believe it or not, in the state of Massachusetts, the DOT will not allow head-in angle parking, but it remains quiet on reverse angle parking, because it's actually what's been proven to be much safer than either head-in or parallel parking for on-street. So it's something to think about again, maybe. But again, it could be a tool for safety. Bike lanes. There's installation of bike lanes throughout the town. There's a lot of community interest in how that might be able to solve things. In many cases, bike lanes are not what you want at all. In many cases, when you get into a downtown street, like Main Street, a bike lane could be the worst thing because it adds cross-section and it's suggesting that bikes and cars shouldn't be riding together. In many cases, it's the best thing for safety for encouraging biking. The #1 bike mode share city in America, I think last year, was not Portland, Oregon. It was Minneapolis, Minnesota. They built it and they came. They had lots of shoulder space and they marked them out as bike lanes, and suddenly their commute share went through the roof. So creating them in the right places makes sense, but sometimes a complete street approach doesn't actually involve separation of all the modes like that. Sometimes the best complete street is blurring the lines of distinction to get everybody to drive a little bit slower, for instance. Transit. Transit in Northampton. A community transit system is an excellent idea. It's an incredibly valuable thing to have. But what really makes it work? You know, what are the numbers behind transit? And the reality of it is, if there's not enough ridership and there's not enough motivation to get on that bus because it's not cool enough or convenient enough or it's used by those other people, unfortunately, is often the case, then it's much more limiting and it's much less potential. How many people really ride the bus regularly in Northampton? 2 hands. And that's because it has, not the right amount. It doesn't go where I want it to go, maybe, or it's not convenient enough, or it's not frequent enough, or I don't know when it's going to be there, or it costs money, whereas biking and walking and at least the perception of driving don't. So transit is an excellent thing to bring into the community more. You have sufficient density in the downtown to make it work, and there's probably sufficient density in the community, the broader region, which is why PVTA runs successful routes. But to really make transit work in your downtown may require a large commitment, not necessarily financial, though that's part of it, in terms of all of the different policymakers to really motivating that change, that shift. And these are major commitments like saying, okay, requiring less parking and requiring contribution to a transit system in your zoning code, for instance. Or actually saying that the bus is going to have priority through an intersection or along your downtown streets. Or recognizing that you may need to sacrifice serving everybody in order to create high enough frequency that serves more people. So these are tough decisions to be making that we should have a discussion about at some point as well. And finally, pedestrians. Mike was telling me earlier, and every time I come into downtown Northampton, I want to tear my hair out about Main, Pleasant, and King, that wonderful downtown intersection, because I look at it and I think, oh my God, why does everybody like this? And part of the reason why pushing that push button works so well, and then throngs of people cross that intersection every time, is because you'd kill yourself if you tried to cross the street at any other point in time. Because that intersection is so big and so confusing, with split phases that run at different times, you can't even predict when the cars might be turning one way or the other. And I see signals all the time, and even last night when there was no traffic, I had to sit there and be careful before I could squirt concurrently across on one side or on the other side. Of course, both times entirely safely without a single conflict, but I wasn't entirely sure. And Mike's observation was that was the first time I'd ever seen a scatter crossing work so well. But sometimes it's the right application, but obviously, as we all know, at that intersection, when all that space is dedicated just to one mode for a period of time and then to the cars for a period of time, it doesn't work as efficiently as it could. So part of thinking about how that intersection might change and changing the thinking of pedestrians in Northampton, I think, is going to be really important. I do not think that pedestrians necessarily outnumber cars at any point in the peak of the peak, but it's darn close. And I think at some locations, it's pretty much heading towards 50-50 if you talk about person movement. And we really get to the fundamentals of traditional neighborhood design. That's what we need to remember. It's all about the pedestrian, because at least half of them are motorists anyways. We're just trying to get them to the other side of the street, to their other destination as it is, and we're not doing the safest job in downtown Northampton, as beautiful as it is. All right. So the walking tours today, we had originally talked about starting them up in about another hour, which gives us some time, unless folks think it would be really valuable to get out there right away, which I'm happy to do as well. Gives us some time to take a little bit of a look at some of these maps that are up front and highlight some of the key areas that we should be paying attention to when we're out there, especially for those of you who can't go on our walking tour. I'd love, if you can't make it out on the walking tour, to sort of coach us through what's going on these maps a little bit, which are hopefully all of the corridor drawn out. And then when we go on the walking tour, we're going to be taking notes very actively. The goal is that at about 3 p.m., we're going to finish up these tours of basically starting up at State and Elm and West and working our way through Main up to King. We're going to kind of come back here ourselves, the consultant team, with whoever else wants to volunteer and help us out, and document everything we've heard, all of these needs and these issues, in as much detail as possible graphically on some boards and presentations. Ultimately, if we can, we're going to incorporate it into a PowerPoint slideshow that will be hopefully running to a larger audience. So if you know anybody who may be coming today, encourage them to come tonight for 7 p.m. I think it is. Spread the word further. We don't know how many folks will show up, but the goal is to get more and more feedback. But what we're also going to do is show you the pictures that we've taken here, but also around the country, and do some comparisons between what best practice might really be and how it looks in Northampton. And hopefully try to do a little bit of comparison on the numbers game too. How many cars you really are handling in your downtown versus some of the other places that we might be able to show you, to begin to get that perspective. But we really want the existing needs and concerns and issues, and we're talking about broken curb ramps, crosswalks that don't make sense, driveways and curb cuts that are of concern. On this tour, we're going to be talking about access management. People mentioned, too many driveways. Where and how can you consolidate driveways? Can you do this through zoning? We'll talk a little bit about the mechanisms that enable that. Are there opportunities to break down what is definitely going on King Street, and to a lesser extent on Main, of each and every building having its own field of parking, and therefore a swath of parking that overall is about 15 to 20% utilized even at the peak of the peak, but each and every individual use has to have their 100-year flood of parking, and what impact that has on development opportunities and on transportation in general. Everything and anything, signing, lighting, and in particular the streetscape environment as well. I know the zoning process will be a little bit more specific about what the streetscape feel is, but I want to hear what folks' hopes and thoughts and concerns are about how that interacts with you as you walk. I mean, the Hotel Northampton, when you look at its front door on King Street, it's this grand staircase, it's this great building of scale, and it's this tiny sidewalk, and I think it's 8 or 10 feet there, and yet it's tiny because it feels like you're just cramped up against the travel lanes, which very infrequently have cars parked actually out in that parking lane there. I guess at different times of the year it's busier. That whole relationship between the pavement and the cars and then this building of significance is broken right now. And making that relationship work a little bit better, I think, is key. I think it's true in all of Main Street. These beautiful facades, these beautiful wide sidewalks, and then a massive amount of space in between for cars moving and for parking. The relationship, just from an aesthetic and land use perspective, is off as well. So I want to hear those kinds of comments and thoughts or criticisms of what I'm saying as well. Now, yeah, I was about to say, thoughts, criticisms. Laura.
Well, no, I don't have any thoughts or criticisms right now, but I just had a question about the charrette because I've never done it before. When, at 1 o'clock for Main Street, walking tour, where do we meet?
Well, hopefully, Wayne, you may want to help me with the logistics of all this. So the first walking tour was supposed to start, I keep looking at that clock and it's an hour behind. The first walking tour is supposed to start at 11, is that right?
We can start earlier.
We can start a little bit earlier. I want to, again, have people come up here and comment if they can't come on the tours. And that would be State and Elm effectively walking down onto Main Street. The Main Street was supposed to start at 1, but you know, I'm relatively flexible in this. If folks would really like to do them all and do it more in a compact time period, say from 11 through to 1 or 2 and do a slightly later lunch, I'm game for that too. If folks want to break up for lunch and have a bit of a discussion, you know, that would be great as well.
Makes sense to do it straight through.
I'm fine with that. I mean, the schedule is, if you've seen the Charrette schedule, which was basically saying that we were doing this session until 11 and then a tour for an hour and then lunch for an hour and a couple more hours tour, that's all. It doesn't matter to me how we do this. I mean, I'm anxious to get outside and see things. I think the weather is supposed to be okay. There might be a small shower, but it's generally good. So I'm happy to just go through the whole thing.
I cannot make the morning walks. I have another city meeting at 11:15.
Okay.
But I do have concerns of the intersection where Dunkin' Donuts is. I have seen many people who use wheelchairs. I mean, the crossing is so dangerous, and also by the Florence Savings Bank intersection there,
Yeah.
that is a disaster. So that's where some of my concerns are, in the upper part of by Stop and Shop.
Okay. And what might be good is if we have a chance to talk in a little bit more detail about that. And the way a charrette works, we really want to hear one-on-one from all of you at some point in time. So today, because we need to try to cover a lot of terrain and get something set up for tonight, if you catch us in the process of that and you can have some conversations with myself, Mike, or Rick, we're all telepathically connected, so any one of us will do. That's excellent, but then tomorrow is actually set up as a studio day, effectively, where we're brainstorming as hard as we can on what the fixes might be and to everything we've documented today, and that is also an excellent time to come on in. We're going to be here, no, I'm sorry, City Hall, in the council chambers at City Hall, pretty much all day tomorrow.
That's at what time in the morning?
That's going to be from 8 a.m. pretty much through till, I think, 4 on the schedule.
So we're I think we're in council chambers tomorrow morning from 8 to 12, hearing room from 1 to 4, and then back over here from 7 to 9.
Okay.
Right. I can make the one in the afternoon, but tonight, we already have a city meeting from 6:30 possibly to 8:30, 8:45.
Okay.
So I'll try to make that one tonight.
Tonight's meeting will be a digestion of what we saw and, slides that help explain a lot of what I've talked about this morning in more detail. But those ideas, those principles, we'll repeat some of them again also on Wednesday night and to some extent
Can I ask,
tomorrow night.
were the times of the walking tours, and was the public and other entities invited to those? I'm just worried about changing the schedule, thinking that people might want to come and show up at those times, and then
We
they'll all
didn't
have
do a
been.
broad outreach for the walking tours. We assume most walking tour people were coming here. Emailed Suzanne back to the chamber, and I don't know who was coming. We assume most people were coming here as part of it. We didn't have meeting space, meeting place.
Joel?
Yeah, I'd just like to raise sort of an overarching conceptual issue, picking up on Bob Reckman's remark from before about the relationship of land use and transportation, which you've alluded to a number of times. And I think that there's often the frustration that the two issues are thought about separately, and I'm hoping that you'll see them together. And I'm, as the frustrated former chairman of the Zoning Revision Committee, we had this sort of chicken and egg problem about, well, what you can do with land use depends on what you do with transportation, and what you can do with transportation depends on what you can do with land use. And the Zoning Revision Committee ended up making a set of recommendations that made certain assumptions about transportation on King Street. Not unreasonable assumptions, but not necessarily the only assumptions. So what I hope you'll be able to do as part of this is look at a range of assumptions or a range of approaches to the redesign of King Street and see what the land use implications are, because it seems to me there are some very different visions for the future of King Street, both different segments of it as well as the street as a whole. And the two issues are so interconnected, but public understanding of that I don't think is clear. I mean, I think our own understanding of it could be greatly enhanced. I mean, the practicality of some of the ideas that have been put forward, for example, for the north end of King Street, which was questioned on the basis, well, it's a high-speed corridor. Well, the question is, well, is it or isn't it? I mean, it is now, but is there a way to make it different? Is it a good or a bad idea? Can mixed-use development, which was mentioned, which is also highly desirable, can it work anywhere on King Street, or can it only work on Lower King Street? Again, these interconnect issues of land use and transportation, and I hope that you won't just be looking purely at the transportation side, but be looking at those connections.
Let me throw this out there for discussion, actually. Transportation and land use, no question, they're tied at the hip. And unfortunately, a lot of thinking about transportation has been that it needs to react to land use density and development by providing automobile capacity, period. And that's not really true if you are trying to make the cars move better. Because King Street has fallen prey to this assumption that, okay, we need to have capacity because of all the commercial potential along King Street. And that capacity, which is extremely auto-oriented, which right now with its access controls, has lots of different curb cuts, is what causes any delays or congestion on King Street. It's a byproduct of itself. If you actually had a street that was smaller, that was more oriented to an efficient form of movement at a slower and safer speed, you'd probably have much less congestion. All the businesses would have much greater visibility because there wouldn't be people focused on traffic and blowing around the car in front of them. Instead, they could look at what's going by them. And you wouldn't have any added delay going from one end to the other. But our orientation has been so bound to creating automobile capacity in response to density. Density, that evil word. Density and traffic have a direct inverse relationship. You have greater density, you get less traffic. This is not something that people in the normal books have looked at. ITE says, more density, the trips go up. It's an automatically direct proportion. But in reality, as density goes up, the opportunities for eliminating those extra vehicle trips and walking between uses immediately go up. If anything, they go up out of necessity. It doesn't matter where you go, the greater your residential density in particular, and certainly your mix of uses, the greater the decline of automobile ownership, of driving in general, of vehicle miles traveled. And that's a hard relationship for traditional engineering to fully understand. It's not well documented in the books, but it's in thousands and thousands of studies that do not make it into the traditional curriculum.
Can you clarify when you're saying density goes up, traffic falls, is that talking about total traffic, total vehicle miles traveled, or are you talking about vehicle miles traveled per capita?
It's a tricky relationship. Yeah, if you suddenly added a Manhattan on King Street, you'd see more cars. There's no question about it. But if you increase the density on King Street and at the same time promote the right kind of mix of uses and provide the infrastructure to actually let people, walk across the street or get from one parking lot to another, breaking down all those barriers is amazing. If you look at mixed-use downtowns throughout America, their parking demand and their trip production is half anything the book says. And that's in small downtowns similar to Northampton, simply because they've been able to make it connected. Those are places that don't even necessarily have good transit access. When you start to look at places that have transit access like you do, that have the potential to add other modes in too, then you can start to see real shifts in mode shift. Just the idea of being able to come into one point of a corridor and not get back into your car until you're done with your experiences is huge. You can knock out, 3, 4, 5 normal car trips just like that. And none of the books accommodate that. None of the books provide this internal capture ratio or this drive-by percentage that, nobody ever wants to knock off more than 50%. And the reality is more like 80% or more. So those types of reality, there are plenty of cities that have shown it and proven it. I can show you all the numbers and I'll show you the examples tonight. But it's hard for us to take that leap of faith and to see that happening until we start to begin to make that mix work. If you could actually take the time and the money to count all of the potential trips that are going on just in your downtown by folks who now today do just park once and hit a number of things, you'd already realize you're at less than a quarter of the traffic that would otherwise have been made by that much floor area. But it's just not what the books tell you. And that's where we need to start trying to recognize that oftentimes the design of the community to make it work from what you want in terms of community value is often, and this is the roadways, is oftentimes far more important than the concerns about what happens in terms of size off-street. You want the design of what happens off-street to be right, but when you start worrying about how much parking is it providing and how big are the roadways and all of that, you start to lose perspective on what your ultimate goal is. Because some of the best, most successful streets in America with twice the volume King Street will ever see, and definitely twice what it has today, are 2-lane streets with on-street parking. I'm trying to sort of, throw some barbs and thoughts and challenges to anybody out there.
I just wondered, Jason, if you were going to be addressing the economics of different modes of transportation. And of course, it's challenging for us to consider laying money out to change infrastructure, but at the same time, we're supporting inherently the most expensive form of transportation available, which is automobiles. It's expensive for individuals, it's expensive for the municipality, and we're tied to it. So what are the options to break out of that locked in, very expensive mode? And is that something that will be coming up during during the charrette?
We'll definitely talk about the numbers of it. What's funny is it's really hard to get around the reality of it. For me to tell you flat out that subsidizing the subsidy for an automobile trip is 4 times that of a subsidy for a transit trip, you'll all think I'm crazy, because that's not at all what we all perceive to be, and that's not at all how the federal funding and all that goes. But what those numbers, that 4-to-1 ratio, really takes into account of is decades of orientation to supporting driving. And all of the infrastructure costs, and we all know it's $20 billion and going up in this state just for the infrastructure of the roadways itself is costly. But then we also don't think about the other things. All of our fire services are oriented to saving homes, and yet 9 out of 10 calls are for traffic accidents. All of our land use planning is extremely compromised in terms of value, especially at the rents and the costs for land in Northampton, by giving away pavement to these creatures that just sit there most of the time, the automobile, that don't benefit from that land and yet don't pay for it. So much of the impacts, environmental impacts that we're all paying for, stormwater, all the infrastructure for dealing with those issues, not to mention the broader environmental issues, is all brought on by decades of subsidizing driving. I mean, Rick has some great slides to talk about how the whole highway system was structured and oriented, but I mean, it is very heavily biased in that direction. I'm not here to say, therefore, cars are evil and will never drive again. I'm just pointing out the basic economics that the subsidies for driving in America, in aggregate, are nearly 4 times what it is for transit. And of course, you don't really need to subsidize much for walking or biking, so they're obviously the most efficient and cost-effective modes. Other thoughts, concerns?
I mean, I certainly understand the virtues and glories of mixed-use neighborhoods. And our downtown and King Street, as far as North Street and Pleasant Street, are perfect examples of the kinds of ways in which mixed-use neighborhoods encourage people to interact and not to drive. I am concerned about, you know, in Northampton, we maybe build 30 to 50 new housing units every year. And so I'm concerned about the idea that we could somehow create mixed-use development on King Street when we already have Hospital Hill, which will provide lots of new housing for the foreseeable future. There are other new subdivisions happening as well. So despite the fact that I think it's a great idea, I'm really skeptical about whether mixed-use development on Upper King Street is a practical approach.
Here's the practicality about it. This country is aging, and I don't remember what the number of years it'll be. The majority of the country is going to be above age. I think it's 50 is the break mark or whatever it is. That's the baby boom. But that whole crowd is increasingly the driving force behind all of the surveys and the responses that say walkable communities, that talk about, and certainly in Massachusetts, the whole concern about driver's licenses for the elderly has cropped up, that talk about not wanting to have to worry about that issue, not wanting to have their cars as a sole form of transportation. The opportunities for dense residential infill close to your downtown and your commercial strip are very, very high. And any new residential that's being permitted in slightly more remote, less walkable, or possibly only drivable areas, even within a mile or 2 radius, are really not going to economically pan out. If you talk to the development community, certainly in the current financing crisis, all they want to do is build things that have an affordable housing component to them, that are transit-oriented to some degree, and that do not require structured parking. They want to be able to build this type of product in downtowns because it's the only stuff that really inks out. The places that see a big garage wrapped by lots of development, which I hope we'll never see in Northampton, but they're, the Denvers, the Minneapolises, the Columbuses, other places of the country that they want to see that, there the economics of it may pan out a little bit at really high density levels. We don't need that here, but you need to change the orientation if you really, the orientation of how housing is provided in Northampton if you really want to see these things happen. I mean, I'd love to live on King Street because of its proximity to downtown if there was the right kind of environment on King Street as well.
And I understand that if we had more housing from Smith to Finn Street to Cons and Pleasant, that'd be super. I'm just very skeptical about whether there is, in fact, a market for housing, for mixed-use development on King Street, for instance, at the Price Chopper Mall, which is not within Colmore, the areas which are plausibly available, because we have so little new demand for housing and so many other sources the city spent a lot of time and money creating.
So much of it has to do with affordability. And if you can build a denser walkable product with one less or zero parking garages on a smaller footprint, it immediately becomes affordable and in many markets extremely desirable. I mean, as long as you're not doing it in Back Bay, Boston, where it's ridiculously expensive, that type of product is what's starting to sell. It's really the only stuff that's got much traction in the market, even nationally, and that's only going to accelerate.
And the problem with that is that the state hospital, which has done a great job building affordable housing, there it's subsidized. I mean, the land is essentially free. Right? So it's hard to build affordable housing anywhere if you pay a reasonable value for the land.
And the key thing is, even if out there it's $250,000 a unit, and on King Street it's $250,000 a unit, the transportation cost percentages are amazing when you start to look at this, and we'll show you some national stats later. I mean, if you assume housing is about a third of your cost in a remote suburban area in the United States, transportation is another third. I mean, you've only got a third of your net income left over for disposables. But if you're in a walkable environment, you can cut that transportation cost down to 10% of your pie, nearly doubling your disposable income.
I live on Fruit Street, which is 100 yards from this building, and I essentially never walk. I'm not proud of that, but it's a simple fact. So if I were to live on King Street...
I'm proud that you have acknowledged that.
No, what can I say? It's a simple fact. So if I were to live on King Street at the coal market property, what are the odds I'd walk? Zero.
In the current environment that King Street is, I'm with you. In fact, in the current environment that Main Street is, I'm almost with you. I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say that, just to go along with what you were saying, as a newcomer here, who's sort of looking at housing opportunities and talking to a lot of people in the process, I think that there's a great hunger for an urban-oriented, walkable housing, well-designed, urban-oriented housing, which barely exists here. And that there are some sites along King Street which are just such the obvious locations for that. And it seems to me to be a golden opportunity to create density, which will create momentum.
There is no question that demand lives in NoHo. I mean, there is no question that this is an epicenter that, I don't know, it doesn't matter who I talk to, people say, oh yeah, I'd love to live in Northampton. That's a cool place. That is only going to continue. I mean, you bring Amtrak in here, you have the changes that are anticipated here. There's no question. I mean, I'm going to move out here one of these days. There's no question about it. And my family is all gone. I'm still going to move out here. The problem is your code. You're pretty much making a lot of that development infeasible or unaffordable. I'm pretty certain, without even having dove into it, about what you're limiting on setback, size, density, and in particular parking. I don't think there's any question in my mind that that's what makes that kind of development impossible. And the ultimate irony is, I don't even know, because I'm sure a lot of things have been flexed over time in Northampton, and Wayne would know the answer to this much better, but I would guess, because whenever I work in any New England downtown, I have this exact problem. What you value can no longer ever be built. I'm pretty confident that's the case. The place that everybody wants to live on Main Street, Northampton, you do not allow. It's against the law. And that's crazy. This is the thing that works, and you won't allow it. I mean, it does, and worse yet, this is stuff that goes back in history. There's a few downtowns in Massachusetts that were lucky enough to not go through that horrible change in zoning that essentially saw second and third stories chopped off due to taxation years ago. And there's still the more walkable places in Massachusetts, but they used to be even more dense than they are now. And there's very few communities who've kept that 3- and 4-story feel. So it's that kind of discussion is really the kind of discussion you need to have more with people who are not in this room today, is that what we value, we literally are not allowing. Our road regulations, our zoning regulations, our codes, what have you, literally can't make what we want. And what really kills me the most is that a lot of it has to do with private property owners in the downtown. A lot of the coordination and the ability to make shared parking work, or to be able to provide the kinds of incentives to get people onto the bus, or to actually vote as a block and encourage the right kind of kickback investment in your downtown and allow other commercial development to come and further build as opposed to compete with them, doesn't work well, because we have a bunch of parochial interests on each and every building in a downtown block. And it was Doug Foy, Office of Commonwealth Development, years ago, before politics destroyed that office here in Massachusetts, would go around the country, would come back here, and he would, he'd almost want to cry, because the rest of the country, with transit-oriented development, at least where there's 1 or 2 owners as opposed to 50, have realized that this is the stuff that sells. And in stucco and wood, they've recreated Massachusetts downtowns, walkable, beautiful facades, far more successfully in no time at all, that have unbelievable trip reduction measures. West Coast, central parts, southeast, everywhere. But here in our own downtowns, of places where it should be happening, the model for this American prototype, it's declining. And, we're at a stage of needing to start thinking about what's going on. And yeah, the gas prices won't hit $5 a gallon now because of the tsunami. They're going to hit $5 a gallon again pretty soon. And yeah, all right, maybe inevitably that'll be pushing us. We need to think a little bit more proactively long term. It's not just about gas prices. It's not just about saving the environment. There's everything to do with obesity. There's everything to do with community values. There's everything to do with safety. And there's everything to do with our children. What kind of environment are we creating for our kids, who now, in the last 20 years, have suddenly stopped ever taking the bus or walking to school, and they're all driven. I mean, that's a huge change in how people's lifestyles will go. And luckily, the current teen, whatever Y generation or wherever they're at, heading out of school, has already shown in overwhelming numbers that they don't want to drive anymore, and they're voting for walkable communities and transit. And I only hope that can continue, because I'm very worried about the 12-year-olds right now. Other thoughts, worries, concerns, before I encourage folks who can't make the tour to come up front?
Again, I guess I would emphasize transition, because, that vision, I think, is not a current or near future reality for Northampton, and the developers that we're hearing from are not interested in doing, and not financially able to do mixed-use development on King Street. And in the transition time, where people work, there is not going to be in those locations. People work and they have to drive, unfortunately, in Western Massachusetts to get to their places of employment. So we can't just immediately assume that we're going to be able to do mixed-use development that has no need for parking and no need for vehicles, because I don't think that's a current reality. And maybe, in decades down the road, and that's a great vision, and we should put the regulations and the incentives in place to achieve that. But what do we do in the interim? And how do we continue to have development on King Street and in our commercial centers that leads us towards sustainability, but also acknowledges the current realities?
I would say this much. I would say that the opportunity for communities to change dramatically in a short amount of time is a little bit greater than we'd anticipate. But I'm not saying it's all going to change in 2 years. You've got development that wants to be built in the span of 5 years that isn't going to see King Street itself, for instance, change dramatically. But if we operate on the assumption, in terms of how that development is built and how the roadway looks, that, okay, we have to plan for more cars, or we have to plan for more parking, and we have to, allow the standalone use to continue, we're not really helping ourselves. In other words, much like Minneapolis, who finally built the bike lanes and they came, and much like places like Portland, which has been mentioned, the other Portland, Oregon, where they, by law, said, okay, here's the urban growth boundary, this is all you get. They changed their landforms rather quickly, because that was the only constraint, was that they couldn't go out and manifest destiny of the countryside. And that, if you look at what has happened in transit-oriented developments that have pretty much been sold up before they got completed, and in standalone places sometimes, not even close enough to their, the downtown of their jurisdiction, you start to realize that people like that stuff. Developers who are afraid to build it are usually limited by two things. One, the code, maybe saying to them, or their belief in the market demands. And two, their own level of sophistication, which is that, you know, the real successful transit-oriented developers and builders in America are still doing that. It's just that, yeah, 80–90% of developers in the country are still, along with the past 50 years of road building mentality and massive curb cuts and dedicated on-site front yard parking and all of that, you know, the garage out front for the residential unit. But the other product sells extremely well. But yeah, I can't tell you of a single builder in Western Massachusetts who's got a lot of experience with it.
Just picking up on Terry's comment, I think that the dimension of time is often missing when a plan like this is done. And so, you know, it's not just sort of an end product of whenever, 5, 10, 20 years. But I think it's important to think about this over time. And that, I mean, just the time horizon it takes from conception of a road improvement, a road diet, or whatever you're going to do, to its actual implementation can be many years. And so, you know, that's the kind of, and if there are certain economic needs today that, you know, they have to be considered, but then we can't, because something is going to take 10 years to achieve doesn't mean we shouldn't start planning for it today. I did a tour of the small cities in the Northwest with Dan Burden, who leads those tours, and we saw a number of great examples where streets like King Street had been put on road diets, and what's interesting about them was that they still had commercial strip development on them because that was there before they did the road diet. And that was the sort of interim non-solution. It was an interim situation. Once developers realized that, hey, we've got a really good street we can build right up to now, then it started to happen. But there's a time, and I think you're right about the sophistication or attitude of different developers. I'm doing TODs in other parts of the country where the developers are just salivating at the opportunity to do that.
I also wonder the size of the community. I think at times, I don't mean to, you know, to sound like a naysayer to you, but you know, oftentimes people overestimate the current market potential of Northampton, and I believe it's there long term, and I believe that we should be putting all of these things in place. But I also think that we need to be cognizant of how long it is going to take to get there, and that we need to continue to have a successful economy in the interim.
Well, the absorption rate here is not going to be, you know, crazy dramatic. We all know that. But I think what's important, and maybe it's refining my response to your question, is that if we don't keep our eye on what it should be ideally, and with every increment work in that direction, you're just not going to get there. Or at least the amount of time to then fix what we built that was halfway there will be much greater due to cost. Part of what I would like to discuss, at the very least, even if we're not charged to deal with these details, is being able to incentivize the right thing from day one. Even if the market doesn't want to build it, you can do, much like we were just doing in a Charrette last week in Ohio, where they are envisioning, you know, an amazing amount of development in far more suburban than you've ever seen. Well, I guess if you go to Indiana, you'll go see it. This is Ohio. And they've really, you know, traditional highway design-oriented approach have really shifted to an entirely different approach. But they know the politics, they know the development. They know that they want to build the skinny streets, they want to share all the parking, they don't want to build too much of it, they want the right densities, but they're also afraid of the economic realities of what can happen. And so what we're going to be setting up with them is incentives that say, if you do the right thing, that's absolutely excellent. We'll even give you incentives to build more or do the right thing. But we as a community will provide the form of backstop that assuages people's concerns, which is to say there's either going to be more on-street parking if we're fearing that there's going to be more cars, or we're going to accelerate the opportunity to share parking with the nearby parcel to control that overflow, or we're going to make sure that the signal has the capacity to handle the car flow, even though ultimately that signal will be designed to have more and more time for the pedestrian. We will need to be able to do things in an incremental fashion, but everything you spend your money on, we need to be ensuring that it can provide that end game. And so much of, you're never going to see any of the, if we sketch out dramatic changes in the roads and out of the zoning process for King Street, there comes a vision for an entirely different corridor. The community needs to know that's not going to happen overnight. But if you incentivize people to do the right thing, and if the people who don't want to do that and want to build underneath the old pro formas, if you at least let them do that in a way that enables their massive rear surface parking lot to be redeveloped someday as a town center, or that allows for a mix of uses or other types of uses to be installed in their first floor plate instead of just auto dealership. You'll have that flexibility as the market realities start to turn around. And there's thousands of examples of buildings and uses that have been redeveloped and converted once it was quite clear that nobody needed the parking lot and ground floor retail was far more valuable than a showroom. But it does take time.
Those are the kinds of problem-solving ideas I'm curious to hear.
Just one quick comment on how fast people can change. Last time gas got over $4 a gallon for 2007, the ridership on the M40, M43, the east-west connection Amherst to Northampton went up 19% in about 4 months.
As far as I know, most transit agencies in America, but maybe this is a bigger city, that transit bubble didn't go away to a large extent. I don't know about PVTA's numbers, but MBTA retained most of those riders even to this day. Not that that's just an aside, I don't think that necessarily means anything, but maybe it got people to realize the bus ain't so bad. And I guess the MBTA has the advantage of, next bus, I know when the next one's coming, so it's pretty
Well,
bad.
it has, a fixed source of income. It's 25% of the sales tax.
Other thoughts, worries, concerns? All right, those of you who cannot come on the walk, come up front, circle this table. I'm going to try to lay this stuff out as clearly as possible. And Mike, Rick, and I are going to listen